Let's look at how detriggering actually works. Here we have Claire and Andrew. They're working on a project together to present to the board next week, and they're having a discussion about how to analyze some of the data that they want to share with the board. But this discussion starts to turn into an argument when Andrew says that he wants to take a much deeper dive into the data than Claire does, because Claire is focusing on the need to come up with a high-level strategic insight. Well, the call gets cut short, and they both end up feeling bad at the end of it when they hang up. Andrew is very worried. He's worried they're going to look like idiots in front of the board because they don't know the data. And Claire is worried too, and she's worried that they're going to look like geeks who just know the data and don't get the big picture. So they go home that night, both feeling upset and angry and simmering over their spat. And they're worried about how the next morning is going to go when they have a meeting with each other to put their slides together. So that night, Claire and Andrew both sit down to do some detriggering. They recognize they're triggered, and they recognize this is not going to help them have a productive meeting in the morning, and they also don't want to go to bed unhappy. So let's look at how Andrew goes through this process. First, he thinks about the external trigger, and that was the argument that he was having with Claire. And he's realizing that he's feeling kind of judged by her and feeling like she didn't care about getting the data right, like she didn't value the data. And she reacted to some of his responses in a way that made him feel like she was not going to support him in doing this deep data analysis. So then Andrew says, well, wait a minute, that's what Claire did, but my trigger is inside me. It's my feeling because of what she did, and that feeling inside me is the only thing I control. So what is my internal trigger? Well, what I'm really worried about, what I'm scared about, and maybe even a little angry about, is feeling vulnerable, feeling like we're going to be unprepared and not ready to answer the board's questions, and feeling a little bit disrespected by Claire because she didn't really value the data analysis the way I do. So let's go with that feeling of anger and even anxiety. And that's when he starts to write his neutralizing letter. So he focuses first on the anger he has at Claire for not respecting the deep data dive that he's suggesting, about his anxiety about feeling unprepared and kind of vulnerable, and feeling like, oh my gosh, is Claire setting me up for failure? Are we just not going to know all the answers that the board's going to ask us because we haven't looked at the data? And then he's going to say, okay, that's how I'm feeling, anxious, angry, disrespected. And then he asks himself, do I have any feelings of guilt associated with this? And he does have a little guilt because he hasn't done the data dive himself yet. So he doesn't really know if it's worth looking at the data more deeply. And maybe he's feeling a little guilty about not having done that preparation, even for the discussion with Claire. And then he says, do I have any sadness here? And he does have some sadness because he likes Claire and he wants them to feel like they're on the same team. And they're really, they're working as a team on this. And then he asks himself, what am I learning about myself? One of the things I'm learning about myself is how often I need other people to agree with me or to come and agree that the way I want to go is the right way to go. Because I'm seeing here that she made some good points, but I'm not really giving her as much credit as she may need either. So I'm also learning that I don't need her permission to do some more analysis on the data. I can do that analysis on my own, at least at some of it, and then bring that back to our conversations. And I'm thankful that I realize I actually have a lot of this under my control. I can do enough of the additional analysis to know whether it's worth asking Claire to spend more time on it too. And there are some things that the data won't show us that I can ask Claire to do to make sure we do have all the answers that we need. So now he's feeling much better because he's recognized that he was angry. He did have feelings that were angry at Claire, but he has some feelings about his own way of engaging in that conversation that wasn't as supportive of her as he would like to be now that he really gets into it. And he's thankful that he now has an action plan. He can start doing some of the analysis, and he can make an ask of Claire some specific things he thinks that she should look at that he won't have time to if he's focused on the analysis. So he's feeling much better when he goes to bed. Now Claire's having a different experience, and she uses detriggering too, but it walks her through a different way of coming at these issues because of what's important to her and who she is. So she sits down to write her detriggering letter, and she thinks about that external trigger, and she realizes that she is angry with Andrew for not appreciating that the strategic perspective she believes is what's going to make the board pay attention to all the data. And she's angry that they couldn't finish the call, and it's leaving her feeling distrustful and feeling like Andrew doesn't have her back, and maybe he won't back her up, and that makes her feel vulnerable and even a little betrayed because she wants them to be a team, and all of a sudden she feels like he's not on her team. And so she takes these feelings and she starts to work with the letter and owning her own feelings, not about what he did and what he said, but about how she's feeling about it. And she looks at the anxiety she's having about not being prepared to talk about the strategic insights that are going to come out of this. She looks at her anger and betrayal. That she feels betrayed by Andrew, and she doesn't think he's going to back her up. And she realizes he probably will back her up, but it doesn't mean she's not still feeling some of that betrayal. She asks herself, do I have any guilt here? Well, I'm guilty for assuming he's betraying me because he probably isn't, so I don't feel good about that. And maybe I'm just too judgmental. I'm making too many judgments here. And then she says, well, what am I sad about? I'm sad that we're not acting like a team because I like Andrew and I like being on this team with him. So I'm sad that we're not in the place where we feel like good teammates right now. And then she says, what am I learning about myself? Well, she's learning how quick she is to judge, how quickly she was willing to feel like Andrew was going to betray her and not have her back. And also she's learning about how important she feels that having the strategic perspective really is in front of the board, and that is something that's natural to her and she's good at, is looking at the strategic implications. And she feels good about that fact. And she's feeling thankful that she can now articulate to Andrew a little better how important she thinks the strategic perspective is, but also she can ask him to have her back with the data and offer to really run with creating the slides on the high-level strategy. She's looking at their meeting in the morning now as an opportunity for a win-win, to let him do more data analysis and let her run with some of these higher-level issues until their next meeting. And now she feels very good about the meeting in the morning. She has a win-win approach to talking to him about his desire to go deeper with the data. And she goes to bed feeling much, much better. Now, what happened here? In both cases, Claire and Andrew recognize that something happened externally. The other person did something or said something that kind of triggered them. But they also understood that it was their response to those actions that actually created the stress and created the unpleasant feelings that were giving rise to conflict. And they take ownership of their own internal feelings. And they also sit down and they work with them, and particularly the negative feelings. They allow themselves to look at what those negative feelings are and to actually feel them. And that helps them see some aspects of it might be valid, but others aren't, that they're jumping to conclusions. They're assuming things about the other person. They're making judgments about the other person that intellectually they know probably aren't valid, but they still feel that way. And they're allowing themselves to have those negative feelings. They're not trying to push them away before they have a chance to actually deal with them. And because they're actually letting themselves have those emotions, when they look at the more positive emotions, what are they feeling that they're learning about themselves? What are they thankful for? What actions can they take on those thankful feelings? Now they're actually able to transfer their emotional focus from the negative to the positive. And they're choosing to actually be in that positive intention, in those positive emotions when they think about what they're going to do. What actions will they take? So the key to their success when they get together the next morning is that they've really let go of the negative emotions because they actually took the opportunity to look at them and then look at the equally valid positive emotions that they could take action from. It's like shifting from one foot to the other, going off the negative focus to the positive focus. So the next morning when they get together, they both do feel better. They're less stressed. They're not really angry anymore. They're not really triggered anymore. And they're focused on what it is they want to do together. And it's worth noting that they still have some differences. They still value the strategic insight versus the data analysis a little bit differently. But they're both coming to this conversation with the idea of a win-win. They don't have to agree 100% with which is more important. They can both take action on the pieces that they feel are most important and come back together to create a stronger presentation. So the conversation's still going to have some bumps in the road, but they're going to come from a much better place and have a much higher likelihood of not only avoiding conflict, but finding alignment and pulling off a really powerful and good, solid presentation to the board that has some key strategic insights and is underpinned by core data analysis. And that's the win-win. And while this example looked at how two people got triggered and detriggered themselves, it's also true that when you're the only one doing the detriggering, you show up at the next conversation much clearer, much less stressed, much less interested in conflict or vulnerable to conflict. And that's usually enough to move the conversation and the relationship forward in a much stronger way.